Hi, everyone. Welcome to Wharton Tech Talks. I'm your co-host, Manasi.
And I'm your co-host, Cynthia.
Today, we're joined by Meera Clark. Meera is a principal at Redpoint Ventures, which is an early-stage venture capital fund based in Menlo Park, California. Redpoint's been a leading investor across sectors, having backed pioneers including Nextdoor, Snowflake, Twilio, and Netflix. Prior to Redpoint, Meera was an investor at Obvious Ventures, a San Francisco-based investment firm that has a particularly strong focus on sectors such as sustainability, consumer wellness, and financial empowerment. Meera has had a long list of amazing accolades, including the Business Insider list of the 55 investors to watch, the Forbes 30 Under 30, and the Venture Forward's Women in VC list. She was also named a Kauffman Fellow in 2022 and is a member of the All Race Summit Steering Committee. Prior to investing, Meera graduated from Stanford University and is originally from North Carolina. Meera, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Always a pleasure.
Great. Well, again, you've had a really wonderful career in investing to date. Would be curious to learn a little bit about your thought process on what drove you to consider investing as a field and what your thought process looked like maybe at the undergrad level or right after graduation.
Yeah, I'll maybe take you all the way back to, elementary school, middle school, high school. Growing up in North Carolina, my family was very different than the families around me. My mother had immigrated to the US. She was a working mom, which was a little bit unusual in, the 90s. And I was being raised in a biracial household. And so I had this big question of, why do people consume what they consume? How is the world around us changing? And what really drives those shifts from a thematic, cultural, and company perspective? And so a lot of my thinking in landing at Stanford was really to see a world as different as possible from the world I had grown up in. At Stanford, I think a lot of my perspectives became even larger questions versus answers, which is both a blessing and a curse. And as I thought about the world that has kind of the most touch points or the greatest exposure across companies, industries, and sectors, really found myself drawn to the world of finance. And so landed at Morgan Stanley post-graduating on the trading floor on a desk called the cross-sector desk. What our role was really looking at thematic changes across industries. Think the evolution of the automotive industry and structuring trades across asset classes to express a point of view based on that theme. So not that different than venture in many ways as it related to that thematic perspective on where the world is headed in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. That said, for me, I realized that I wasn't actually doing anything. I was watching lines go up and down on a screen, but I didn't really have that company touch or that company impact, which was something I was really craving. And two, I didn't have the same level of accountability as it related to taking a strong point of view and then actually tracking it over time. I was pitching an idea onto the next, pitching an idea onto the next. And so what really compelled me to move into the world of investing was, one, having a little bit more accountability or kind of seeing the ideas through to the very end. Two, having a much closer touch with these businesses and really being able to feel the impact, the points of view or investments that I was making. And then three, kind of taking a step back and asking myself, beyond the intellectual simulation, what do you really love about your job? And for me, the answer was beyond obvious, and it was the people. And so I think the beauty, particularly of early stage investing, is sure, we're investing in businesses, we're investing in ideas, but at the end of the day, more than anything else, we're investing in founders and we're investing in teams and working alongside of them to see the various ways that we can enable them to be successful. And so I think it's really that combination to me that stood out about the investing role and kind of led my winding pursuit to land in this world.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I liked your points about growing up and having that curiosity about, what drives decisions consumers are making, how can we maybe predict it in a way through our roles as investors. And then when you think about early stage, naturally, there are some categories within that, you can kind of be almost in the pre-seed category towards seed and then maybe Series A. How did you think about what your sweet spot was and, what major differences you might have noticed across those areas?
Yeah. So if I were to oversimplify, I would somewhat similarly to you group the private markets into three, or I guess four buckets, if you will, kind of working late stage to early stage. One being private equity. These are obviously very mature businesses and are much more focused on capital extraction, let's call it, than growth, which to me was less compelling in terms of kind of betting on where the future of the world was headed. Moving down from there, you land in this growth land, which, given my time in banking post sales and trading, I saw a lot of my peers going there. And so I think there was an open question of, does this make sense for me? Moving earlier than that, I would call it early stage, which is where I think of myself as playing kind of larger seed Series A's. And then earlier than us is really kind of that pre-seed seed land. As I sort of thought about what I like, or the world in which I thought I could be the best investor and be most helpful to founders, it really came down to two desires. One is to invest in people and work alongside people. And the other came down to this obsession with ideas and this desire to be thesis driven. And so as we kind of think about the three buckets of pre-seed, seed, early stage growth, in my opinion, which is an N of one opinion, I think that the earlier stages, so call it pre-seed through Series A, end up being the most people driven and the most human capital intensive as it relates to being on the phone, text, email, Slack with a founder at every hour of every day. And honestly, or hopefully loving it if you love what you do. And so I knew I kind of liked that hands-on approach versus the later stages where these companies have established teams, established advisors. You're certainly jumping in at certain points in time, but particularly as a junior investor, there's maybe a capped amount of value you could add. So that's what drew me to the earlier stages. That said, as I looked at kind of the pre-seed seed bucket versus Series A bucket, I found that a lot of investors, or a lot more investors rather, at Series A tended to be sector specific or thesis driven than at seed. I think in part because so many of these pre-seed companies end up pivoting, 3 months in, 6 months in, 9 months in, and it is so much of a team bet. And I think also because as a result of the fatality rate of businesses at that stage, people are just making a lot more investments. And so the idea of, can you make 10 investments a year into climate businesses if you want to only invest in businesses that are not competing with one another, it just becomes a lot harder. And so you need a little bit more scope, or it's beneficial rather to have a bit more scope. And so, I gain a lot of comfort in having some expertise is maybe a stretch, but at least some data or market awareness to lean on, which I found at Series A versus pre-seed and seed. And I think the added bonus is that at least these more mature Series A's certainly leverage a little bit more of my banking background or modeling background. And so I think all of these stages are amazing fits for the right person. But for me, kind of this early stage seed Series A sweet spot really made a lot of sense.
Super interesting. And you mentioned that thematic origination and sort of thesis-driven investing strategy that appealed to you. At Obvious, it looks like a couple of the key sectors were consumer health and wellness, and then separately financial empowerment. Was curious, how did you arrive at those being maybe sectors you wanted to spend time in? And what advice might you have for folks who say, I definitely don't want to narrow my scope, but maybe I do want to spend a little bit more time in certain key categories once I join the world of investing?
Yeah, I would say the lazy and privileged answer I will give you is that I wanted to spend my Tuesdays the same way that I spend my Saturdays. And these were sectors that I was deeply interested in and was reading about, listening to podcasts on, kind of exploring on my own. I think that a lot of people in the world of investing are really smart and work really hard. And so the easiest way, or arguably the only way, to kind of keep pace with them is to be investing in an area that you are deeply interested in, and you too have that similar pull to be kind of ideating around every hour of every day. And so for me, I found it to be a lot easier in something like consumer health and something like, financial empowerment and something like climate, areas that I do deeply care about, that I have natural networks in, because as a result, a lot of the quote unquote thesis development or work I'm doing doesn't necessarily feel like work. And that's been really helpful. I think another component of choosing to double down on a sector versus being generalist, particularly early in your career, is that it enables you to develop stronger pattern recognition in maybe a smaller pond. You can get really strong network density or maybe data density because you're looking in a smaller field. And so as I think about differentiating between good versus great, it's much easier for me, right? If I've seen 5 companies that look similar versus 5 companies in entirely different sectors. And so I think it gets your flywheel going a little bit faster, one. Two, I also think one element of this job and an important element of this job is winning and winning deals. And I think with a founder who has a choice between someone that has been doing this job for 20 years or someone that's been doing this job for 5 years, being able to show that industry expertise, that deep understanding of their business, and your ability to add value in a very industry specific way because you have those relationships, you have that knowledge base, can be really valuable. And so I also think that particularly for folks in, call it the first decade of their career, it can be really helpful.
For sure. And, within those categories, obviously a lot's changed over the past couple of years. I know financial empowerment still remains a key area of focus, both in regards to having maybe direct to consumer options and then also somehow tying in financial empowerment solutions into employment benefits, maybe. Of course, consumer health and wellness has also had a couple of new outgrowths ranging from women's health all the way to new approaches to fitness and maybe personalization in that area. Are there one or two areas within those topics that still stand out to you? Maybe it's a personal passion or maybe it's something you've continued to follow.
Yeah, I would say within consumer health and wellness specifically, one area we've thought a lot about is longevity. We have not made a bet yet. But I think what's interesting about longevity is a few things. One is that the cost of a lot of these, let's just call them lab tests or diagnostic solutions, kind of getting to the data layer has come down dramatically. And so we've gotten to a place where it's actually feasible for maybe not an everyday American, but millions of Americans to afford kind of this information at their fingertips, one. Two, as we think about consumer health and what really drives to successful outcomes, it is that repeat purchase behavior and that repeat usage. I think not Americans, but humans in general are incredibly vain. And so the ability to sell vanity, we've seen time and time again, works. And so from a longevity perspective, whether that is skin health, hair health, maybe it is more hormonal health or bone health, some of these things that really make them feel demonstrably better each and every day. I think we see those as very sticky businesses and very, high AOV businesses. And so, we would love to do something in longevity if and when the right opportunity arises. On the economic empowerment front, I think we're thinking a lot about the role that AI plays in shifting the labor force. Obviously, not a particularly novel idea, something that I think everyone and their mom seems to be discussing these days. But a lot of what we're thinking about is the fact that not only will AI probably lead to or potentially lead to smaller workforces at many of these companies. We've already seen so many of these layoffs this year, which leads to more available talent or people looking for ways to monetize their skills. But AI also makes monetizing these skills that much easier. And so we're thinking a lot about this, I don't know if I would call it a latent labor pool, but kind of this invisible yet very large labor pool. Call it the recent retiree who wants to make more money, the stay-at-home mom who now has additional free time on her hands, the former tech worker who doesn't like their job and wants to move somewhere else and do something different, kind of enabling them to become a travel agent, enabling them to become a copywriter, enabling them to take on any of these various roles by not only streamlining a lot of the back office stuff that had made starting your own business a total headache previously, but that also enables them to get up and running that much faster because it streamlines the work. It takes, B+ work to solid A work or whatever it is, but kind of thinking about these we can call them vertical software solutions because that's what they are. They're prosumer tools that are really enabling like a much broader base or a much less traditional base of workers to earn money doing what they want to be doing.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And another area that I think a lot of our listeners will have a particular interest in. Wharton has invested a lot in ESG and sustainability related initiatives. And I know that's one area that you've also thought about and invested in, both at Obvious and at Redpoint, especially with your investment in green places. Curious sort of, are there a couple things that really excite you about that area? And looking forward over the next year or two, are there domains that you have really honed in on as being the most exciting?
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting time to be investing in, let's call it quote unquote climate, though I don't know if any of us really knows what that means for a variety of reasons. I think first and foremost, the regulatory backdrop and this need to have, not nice to have movement towards a much greener world. I think we very much believe in the electrification, maybe not of everything, but of most things or a lot of things. And a lot of that will be driven by regulatory mandates. Two is the increasing incentives, obviously brought forth by the IRA and many of the other incentive programs that have been pushed forward at the state or even municipal level. I think in states like California, right, you can build a massive business in the state alone. And so thinking about how that's dramatically shifting both demand as well as the cost of doing business for these companies. And then finally, it's just the overall cost curve for these solutions. Deploying renewable energy in many instances has never been cheaper. All the cost of buying, call it dirty energy, is, I don't want to say skyrocketing, but it's becoming increasingly volatile, not only due to climate change, but also a lot of geopolitical uncertainty facing the world today. And so I think we sort of view this as a perfect storm for category creation or like fundamental shifts in how the world operates. What that means for us is that I think there are a few very large and meaty categories that we have been thinking about as areas of opportunity where one could build a really big business. One obviously was kind of thinking through the emissions accounting component as it relates to the regulatory changes, and Green Places is very much building in that world. Two, where I think we've been spending an increasing amount of time is kind of thinking about, let's call it power procurement broadly, and how we power our buildings, whether those are our homes from like a residential energy perspective or corporate offices from a commercial perspective or C&I point of view, kind of procuring that power, managing the usage of that power in a way that's more efficient than it is today, that not only does it do well for the planet, but I think equally as importantly, or probably more importantly for a lot of businesses, it saves a ton of money and makes their power supply much, much more resilient. So I've been spending a lot more time kind of thinking about power procurement and power generation, more from like a software perspective or data infrastructure perspective, just given our orientation as a fund, but kind of thinking what that means. And then finally, I think there's a lot that's happening in supply chain, in part because of a lot of the supply chain disruptions that we've seen. And I think there's a lot of really interesting applications of AI in that world. And so again, as we sort of think about the best markets to bet on being first and foremost large, but secondarily having maybe not even one, but ideally a handful of tailwinds at their backs. Supply chain is another one where it's been a really slow category to change, and it's been a dog of a buyer to sell into. However, it does feel, at least at the surface, that the tides might be shifting there. And so it's one we're watching closely.
Yeah, that's amazing. And, we've spent a lot of time digging into really fascinating thematic changes. I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about the other side of being an early stage investor, which is spending a lot of time supporting your founders. And as you were mentioning earlier, a big draw to why you pursue this career in the first place. What are the most common challenges you've seen for early stage founders in your portfolio? Like, what are they seeking assistance with?
I think top of mind for almost every founder is hiring. At the end of the day, the best companies are built by the best teams, and building the best teams means recruiting the best talents. I think in many ways, as an early stage founder, you are asking someone to do the irrational and joining you, right? They can make more money elsewhere. They have more job security elsewhere. And there's probably a little bit more glamour associated with the company people have heard of. And so you're asking them to take this leap of faith on, in many ways, you as a founder, you as an individual, as well as the market you're building into the product that you're building. And so a lot of what we try to support founders with, and I think you'll consistently hear this from other members of my team, as well as our portfolio, is identifying that talent, kind of understanding not only is this person, 11 out of 10 awesome at product marketing or whatever it is, but they're also a fit for this business culturally, in terms of like sector candidate fit and interest. Like they need to love it, or we want that. It would be nice if they love it. And so really thinking about identifying those candidates, and then it is closing those candidates and compensating those candidates and kind of thinking through what are the benchmarks, what is appropriate, what can we offer them to help them get comfort with this business, whether that's additional information, whether that's references, whether that's compensation, all of the above. But I would say it's really building the bench that is top of mind, I think, not only for us, but also for kind of founders across our portfolio, because they're always going to know more about their industry than we do, right? They're always going to know much more about their product, or we hope they know much more about their product than we do. But it is kind of having that bird's eye view on the talent market, that they're busier doing much more important things for their business on the day-to-day perspective. But those are areas where we feel like we can kind of add value or provide a complementary perspective or complementary support.
Yeah, and I'm curious, what is your advice to founders? At what point should they start thinking about bringing on, executives and building up that management bench versus, in the very early days of a startup, kind of just grinding it out in the classic, like in a garage, figuring out your product market fit? Like, when do you advise them to transition into really thinking about bringing on experts who are the best in like finance, HR, whatever it may be?
Yeah, I would say the overly simplified answer is do not make the hire until you really need it. I work with a company in our portfolio who probably has 10-ish full-time employees and a network of probably 60 third-party contributors, whether that's contractors, advisors. Some of these people are doing, 2 hours a month. It's not very much, but it's much more efficient for them to do it for 2 hours a month and do this thing they're really good at versus hiring, a generalist who can kind of sort of do it, and it's going to take 4 times as long. And so I think there are creative ways you can approach building your quote unquote bench. As it relates to full-time hires though, I think it becomes a question of what will this person unlock, as well as what is the opportunity cost of hiring them. And I would say the opportunity cost of hiring them is something that's maybe not thought about enough, but I think is an important point to make, because once you have a head of product, or let's say you hire a VP of product, day 1, day 2, day 3, it becomes really hard to hire on top of them. Or they might have the expectations of, I am king of the hill, whatever their hill looks like in those early days. And it can create some cultural conflict when you begin layering on top of people, or maybe conflicting with their expectations 6 months into a business, 9 months into a business, 12 months into a business. Over time, companies outgrow even some of the best candidates. Some people are just so great at 0 to 1, and that's what they should be doing all the time, whereas other people spike in other areas. And so I'm not saying that you should never hire on top of people, but it's one of those questions of, is the person I'm hiring today going to be the right person in 6 months? And if the answer is no, like they're probably better off as a contractor. If the person you're hiring today is the right person in 18 months, maybe not in 36, like I would say absolutely hire them if, again, you think they can be transformational to the business in terms of the doors they can unlock, the insight they can unlock, the product they can unlock if they're an engineer. So there's a little bit of a case-by-case basis, but I think it's kind of weighing those two components.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, I think it's kind of the best and the worst decision you can make for a startup is hiring. So it's really, it could be a total amplifier or a total disaster.
Very quickly on the latter front, for better or for worse.
Yeah. Many of our listeners are students who are aspiring to go into investing. I'm sure they would love to hear some words of advice from you. What skills do you believe are the most valuable when it comes to early stage venture investing? And how can students advertise their proficiencies in these areas?
Yeah, I think there's some nuance in that. I think the most important skills to have as an investor are not necessarily the skills that firms are hiring for, which is a little bit of a challenge, but it is what it is. I think to be a great investor, you need to be deeply curious, which I think you can express. You need to be great at operating in ambiguity, which I think as a type A individual like myself can be challenging, if not very challenging, but it's very important. Kind of showing that your self-directedness, showing your ability to drive to an outcome, regardless of whether you were asked to do so, kind of that creativity. And then I think it's also really important to have that empathy or EQ, depending on kind of how you want to think about it. Again, at the early stages, we are investing in people and they are choosing to partner with people. And so it's how do you break through the noise to get that first meeting? How do you establish trust with the founder? How do you get them to choose you over other offers? Like those skills are really important. And so it's funny, right? Because I think so much of interview prep or prepping for these jobs is reading as much as possible about industries or ensuring you know how to build a cap table or a three-statement model. And those are requisites to the job and things that folks will test for. But many of those are skills you can learn. I think the skills you can't learn are probably the ones that we think about the most in terms of what separates a run-of-the-mill investor versus a great investor.
Yeah, I think like I've heard other investors say that venture investing is truly a people business, both in terms of talking to other founders and also talking to other investors and just, always thinking about how can you add value in the ecosystem. So I think to your point, there's definitely a lot of soft skills beyond the technicals that, will differentiate what's a good investor versus not. One of your favorite quotes, which we took from Redpoint's website, is "In order to be irreplaceable, one must always be different" by Coco Chanel. I absolutely love the quote. I'm also curious, to the conversation we're just having, to what extent do you think taking a contrarian view is required to being a good investor?
I think taking a contrarian point of view or having comfort taking a contrarian point of view is incredibly important. I think many of the best deals, and people say this a lot, but many of the best deals are often the most controversial or not obvious at time of investment. That said, there are also a lot of themes with pretty clear tailwinds, and it's a matter of getting the best possible founder in the field to want to work with you over any other fund. Not every deal is out of consensus or contrarian. I think what is important kind of in situations that are contrarian is still being able to stand out and kind of be memorable to the point of why are they choosing to work with you? If you look like every other investor that's been in their inbox that day or on their calendar that day, it's hard to come up with that reason. And so I think being able to offer something different, whether that's a perspective, whether that's podcast fame, whether that's a higher level of empathy or trust, whether that's a deeper Rolodex of connections, I think kind of understanding what your one or two superpowers are, or understanding kind of how you can flex your strengths or your toolkit to best accommodate the situation is super important. And something that's really cool to watch from the best GPs as it relates to them being authentic, but I think kind of flexing different elements of who they are based on what the situation requires.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And now into the final part of this episode, we'll ask you a few rapid fire questions. The rule of the game here is to try to answer in 2 sentences or less. Are you up for the challenge?
Let's do it.
All right, to start, do you have a favorite Bay Area restaurant?
I would have to say Foreign Cinema, which is so basic and boring, but it is freaking fantastic.
Yeah, I can second that.
What is your spirit animal?
Definitely a meerkat, which is what my dentist started calling me when I was a child, and the nickname that carried me through high school and college.
I remember.
That's hilarious. Oh, what's your New Year's resolution looking like it will shape up to be in 2024?
Remember what matters. I think it's so easy to get caught up in the stress or the angst or looking back on the, did I say the right thing or did I miss this company? And I think focusing on fewer things, but placing more intentionality around them is something that I keep trying to do. So I'm sure I will be equally as excited to lean into next year.
Yeah, that's a really good one. Final question for you. What's the best piece of career advice you have ever received?
I don't know if it's the best, but the most memorable piece of career advice that pops into my head, probably more than I should admit, is a piece of advice that the head of sales at Morgan Stanley gave me, and it was to ask for the order. I think, particularly as women, candidly, we at times are very sensitive and we're like prepping the sale, showing how we're a great candidate or whatever it is. And then we don't ask for the order or try to close the deal. And so I think being direct in that way, and you can do it politely, you can do it kindly, you can do it professionally in a way that's not pushy. But I think, it's that asking for the order that I continue to come back to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think there's a direct parallel to the business of venture investing, which we were just talking about as well. So that wraps the end of our episode. We wanted to thank you so much for joining us on this episode and for sharing your experience as an investor. I personally loved every minute of it, and I'm sure that our listeners will learn a lot once this episode is published. So thank you so much, Meera, for joining us.
Thank you again for having me.